This is the application project presentation of Group 5 for SPED 330. Our group is doing the project option number 25, which is to read a fiction or nonfiction book written by or about someone with a disability, and then to summarize the 6 principles of idea, whether they are met or not met in the book for the main character. Our group decided to read Out of My Mind by Sharon Draper. So just a quick overview of what this book is about. This book is about a character named Melody, who is 11 years old, and she has a photographic memory, and she also has cerebral palsy. This is a realistic fiction book, but it is based off of the author's daughter, who also has cerebral palsy, and has many other similarities in personality to Melody. All 6 principles of idea are visible throughout the book, whether they are met or not met is different for each one. So the first principle of idea is zero reject. Schools must educate all children with disabilities. This in this book, it seems like Melody's school does comply with this principle of idea. All students are given the right to have an education and are not turned away because of their disability to get an education. However, many of them are not receiving the correct education by the school. Technically, there's no rejects, but most of the students are not being taught at the appropriate level for them. So, for example, Melody is 11 and incredibly smart, but not everyone sees that and often assumes that she's not smart just because she cannot walk or talk. So she's not being taught at the appropriate level for much of the book. For example, in one chapter of the book, she talks about how when she was in 3rd grade, she was incredibly smart, ahead in learning, and was listening to audiobooks of chapter books. However, she was being taught by her 3rd grade teacher the alphabet, even though she was well past this level where she needed to be taught that at all. The teacher was not doing her job of understanding what Melody's needs were, or even trying to figure out what those needs were. Melody talks about how each teacher has to take notes on what the student understands and learns, and it's pretty obvious that her 3rd grade teacher did not read those notes or did not take them seriously, and just assumed that because Melody couldn't walk or talk, that she could not think like a 3rd grader, even though it's very obvious as you read the book that Melody is well above the maturity level of a child who needs to be taught the alphabet. She's incredibly mature for her age. So, yes, technically, the school does comply with the zero reject policy of IDEA for students with disabilities. However, they're not truly giving those students the education that they need, not just with Melody, but Melody talks about other students who are also not receiving the proper education that they need as well. So that's for the first point of zero rejects.
For the novel Out of My Mind, written by Sharon Draper, we all assessed the 6 different principles of IDEA. The 2 that I covered were free appropriate public education as well as least restrictive environment. For the most part, Melanie has access to a free appropriate public education. She has access to her wheelchair as well as her metatalker, and she is the only one who determines when she goes back to the special education classroom while she is in general education. She also has a para that goes with her to class. Before this, while she was still in school, Melody didn't always have the opportunities that she does now, and that was very hard on her. When she was younger, her education consisted of her teachers being very spotty and teaching her the same basic things over and over again because they were convinced that the children were just retarded, as they mentioned in the book. Although the school didn't provide her with her meta-talker, she still is allowed to use it as a part of her accommodations. The one thing I didn't really notice be mentioned very much was how Melody's general education teachers were accommodating to her being in the classroom. She mentions that even though she gets to participate in general education classes, she has to sit in the back of the classroom and it doesn't make her feel very included. Her teachers don't really see a problem with this, even though Melody could sit on the end of a row, so she isn't blocking a student behind her, just to feel a little more included. Another thing that I really would have liked to see was her teachers reiterate, or even have Melody's mom come in and talk about what her condition is to the classroom as a whole to help with the transition. The teachers didn't really see the need to step back and see that it was a reoccurring issue that children were saying rude things in front of her face and accusing her of cheating. Least restrictive environment. Melody's school does abide by the guidelines for least restrictive environment, although it wasn't always like this. When Melody first started education in general, she did not receive the opportunity at first to go to other classrooms in general education. She was excluded to specifically only the special education room, along with everyone else. This often bored Melody, and she would occasionally have a meltdown. The first class she ever took in general education was her music class, and that was only once a week. It was expanded again, and she was later able to join an English language arts class and a history class, which really seemed to improve Melody's mood about school, as well as give her the opportunity to show her peers that she is smarter than they think she is. She really tries to break those stereotypes that some of her classmates have about her. One of those stereotypes being that she isn't competent enough to understand what everyone is saying around her.
So, the principle of idea that I covered was non discriminatory identification and evaluation. So, in the book, when Melody is getting ready to go to school at 5 years old, her parents bring her to a special doctor who is supposed to give her a series of tests to determine how intelligent she is before she starts school. Unfortunately, this doctor that they went to did not give her tests that could fairly demonstrate how much she knew. So, a lot of the tests he asked were things that required her to do things like stacking blocks. So, he gave her a series of blocks and asked her to put the biggest blocks on the bottom and then smallest blocks on top. Well, Melody had a lot of issues moving her limbs, and she didn't have the coordination to stack blocks like that. But instead of recognizing that it was because of her physical handicap that she couldn't do that, the doctor assumed that mentally she just didn't know which blocks were bigger. So that was one example during that test. And another question he had asked her was he showed her four animals and he asked her which one of these animals is a mammal. Well, Melody had watched tons of videos and TV shows talking about, like from National Geographic, talking about animals, and she knew that all of those were mammals. And so she pointed at one, and it wasn't the one that he thought she should have pointed to, and so he marked her as getting that one wrong. And after quite a few questions like this, or like the fact that she wasn't able to say the word pink, well, she couldn't talk, so of course she wasn't able to say a word when he asked her to. And so, because of all of these questions she got wrong, he told her parents that mentally she was just as handicapped as she was physically. And her parents obviously didn't believe him because they knew that she was very smart. In fact, they didn't realize, but she did, was mostly had a photographic memory. And so she went into school then, and the school just saw this examination by the doctor saying that mentally she is handicapped as well. And so she really didn't receive the schooling or the education or the help that she wanted or needed. And until she was in fifth grade. So they just put her in the special education room, and the teachers really didn't teach her that much. One teacher, when she was in like third or fourth grade, was teaching them the alphabet. And of course, Melody already knows that, but she has no way of telling the teacher that she already knows that information. And so, until once she got into fifth grade, they finally started doing inclusion classes where she could go into general education classrooms. And then she also got a Medi Talker, which would help her communicate with the people around her instead of just pointing at a board with words on it. And so after that, they also gave her someone to help her with movement around the school. So someone who would be like an aide to be with her throughout the day to help her with her general education classes and to help her get from place to place. And it wasn't until that point that people started to recognize how smart she was and how much she actually knew. But even at that point, the school never took any appropriate measures to actually do another test to see how much does she actually know, where in school should she be based on her mental abilities, because she was incredibly gifted. And so overall, I would say that the principle of non-discriminatory identification and evaluation was not met in Melody's education because they never did identify or evaluate her in a way that was non-discriminatory um, for her physical handicap.
In the book, Melody's school follows due process safeguards. Melody is given resources such as a new wheelchair. However, Melody's next-door neighbor, Mrs. V, helped her practice her wording and grammar on her machine all throughout Christmas break and continued practicing with Melody throughout the school year as much as possible. But this was not a resource given by the school. On page 139 of the book, chapter 16, the first paragraph, it states, I wait until after the holiday break to take the machine into school. I have practiced with Mrs. B every single day of Christmas vacation, learning how to push the right buttons, how to switch smoothly from one level to another, how to make contractions. I had to figure out how to say isn't instead of is not, or there's instead of there is. It was hard. I kept messing up, but Mrs. V wouldn't let me quit. I didn't want to. Though Mrs. V was the adult giving Melody the training with her machine, that wouldn't discount the work that the school has done because the school is there to give the same resources as the normal or gen ed kids, and the school teachers and aides aren't there to train her with these devices like her machine. The teachers and aides may help her a little bit, but they aren't, for lack of better words, the sole trainer. Melody's school has given her resources and experiences that follow this principle of idea, which makes me feel that this principle of idea is being followed. In the book, it looks like Melody's school follows shared decision making. Melody's teachers and peers begin inclusion classes to help her and her peers thrive in the school environment. Melody is also given, for the first time, the opportunity to switch classes for different subjects. Though this may be a small or normal thing for us, it is huge for her to be allowed to switch between classes. This shows that she has made progress in her learning. On page 90 of the book, chapter 11, the first paragraph, it states, Fifth grade started a few weeks ago, and a couple of cool things have happened. Well, I didn't get a gadget that makes Garfield-like speech bubbles over my head, but I did get an electric wheelchair. And our school began something called inclusion classes. I thought that was funny. I've never been included in anything. But these classes are supposed to give kids like me a chance to interact with what everybody else calls normal students. Melody is given the opportunity to experience a similar day-to-day schedule as her normal or gen ed peers. This, which also can help Melody to feel more welcomed and wanted in the gen ed classroom. This also can show the trust that her teachers and aides have put in her. The principles of IDEA are incredibly important to follow in order to make sure all students have received and receive a free and appropriate education specifically designed to meet each student's unique needs. Overall, we believe that most of the principles of IDEA were met. We understand that not all principles of IDEA were met in Melody's school, and that Melody's school could potentially benefit from putting more time into following the principles of IDEA more closely to benefit Melody and her other special education peers in the future.